So I'm going through my comment section from my gentrification video that I previously did, and I come across a pretty interesting comment. Nobody talks about crime. James Lawrence M4E has this to say, and I think that's a good post. I think this is something that we need to start talking about, right? So let's talk crime today. Crime is something I think people on both sides of the Detroit conversation have a tendency to oversimplify because depending on who you're talking to, you get one of the two versions of Detroit. Version number one, Detroit is dangerous. Don't go there. Your car is going to get stolen, right? You're going to get robbed. Don't stop at the gas station. Don't even make eye contact with anybody. Basically, according to some people, the second you cross 8 Mile, the Grand Theft Auto soundtrack starts playing, right? Then there's version number two. That's old Detroit, right? Crime is way down. Downtown is safe. The city has changed. People exaggerate. And to be honest, there's truth buried inside both of those perspectives, right? Crime in Detroit has fallen dramatically, right? That is not marketing. That's data. But crime in Detroit is also still a very, very real quality of life issue for a lot of residents, businesses, property owners, and neighborhoods, right? And I can tell you that personally because I have had tenants become victims of theft, right? I've dealt with the phone calls. I've dealt with the aftermath. I've dealt with the question every landlord hates hearing. What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? So today I want to have what I think is a more balanced conversation. Not Detroit is dangerous and not crime isn't a problem anymore, right? Instead, how much safer has Detroit actually become? Why can crime be falling dramatically while residents still feel like crime is a serious problem? And what does crime actually mean for the people trying to live, invest, operate businesses, and build neighborhoods in Detroit? Because those are very, very different questions. First, I'd like to acknowledge the good news, right? Let's start with something that deserves considerably more attention than it gets. Detroit has made enormous progress on violent crime. According to preliminary year-end numbers released by the city of Detroit, Detroit recorded 165 criminal homicides in 2025. In 2024, 203. In 2023, 252, right? That means homicides declined roughly 35% in just 2 years. Think about that. Detroit went from 252 homicides to 203 to 165, and 165 represented the city's lowest homicide total in decades. That's not a statistical rounding error. That's potentially dozens of people who are still alive, dozens of families that didn't lose somebody, dozens of crime scenes that never happened. And the improvement wasn't limited to homicide. Detroit reported 447 non-fatal shootings in 2025, down from 603 the previous year, right? That's a 26% decline in just 1 year. And compared with 2020, when Detroit recorded 1,176 non-fatal shootings, they've fallen by roughly 62%. Carjackings, 142 in 2024, just 77 in 2025. When I say just, carjackings, even one makes me sick, right? That makes me cringe, right? I'd never want to find myself in any of these scenarios. But with that being said, that's down 46% in a single year and 84% compared with 2015. Robberies fell from 1,209 to 953. Sexual assaults fell from 613 to 529. Aggravated assaults fell from 9,878 to 9,045. Overall violent offenses fell approximately 10%. And that's important, right? Detroit isn't operating in a vacuum. Crime has been falling nationally as well. The FBI reported that violent crime declined nationally in 2025, with homicide falling particularly sharply. So we need to be careful about attributing Detroit's entire decline to one politician, one police chief, one prosecutor, or one program or policy, right? Crime is complicated, but regardless of exactly how the credit gets divided, Detroit is safer today by several important measures than it was just a few years ago, right? That's worth celebrating. But here's where the conversation gets complicated. Somebody is going to hear everything I just said and say, see, I told you, Detroit's safe now. Whoa, 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 hold on. Because that's not necessarily what the numbers say either, right? There's a major difference between safer and safe, right? Those words sound familiar. Statistically, they're completely different concepts. If something goes from an extremely high level to a significantly low level, that's tremendous progress, right? But the remaining level can still be high. Detroit's homicide rate in 2025 was roughly 25 per 100,000 residents. For perspective, the national homicide rate in 2025 was around 4.1 per 100,000 residents, right? So Detroit's homicide rate was still roughly 6 times the national rate. That doesn't erase the progress. It puts the progress into context. Both statements can be true. Detroit has experienced an extraordinary reduction in homicide, and Detroit still experiences significantly more homicide per capita than the country overall, right? That's the nuance that tends to disappear online. Here's another mistake we make when discussing crime, right? We immediately jump to murder, which obviously homicide is incredibly important to pay attention to, but that's not necessarily the crime that affects the average person's daily behavior. A resident might never personally witness a shooting, but they may have their catalytic converter stolen, their car window smashed, their package stolen, their wheels stolen, their vehicle stolen, right? Their garage broken into, right? Their construction site burglarized. That happens a lot from the real estate developer / investor side, right? Their business is vandalized. And suddenly, crime isn't something they saw on Channel 4. It's something they're dealing with Tuesday morning before work. Detroit recorded 25,888 major property offenses in 2025. 25,888. That included approximately 15,239 larcenies, 6,391 motor vehicle thefts, 4,258 burglaries. Again, there's good news, right? Property crime declined approximately 9.7% overall. Motor vehicle theft fell more than 23%. That's fantastic. But 6,391 stolen vehicles, right? That's still thousands of people having one of the worst mornings imaginable. This is where this conversation stops being theoretical for me, right? I've had tenants at my properties become targets of theft, right? I've had incidents involving vehicles. I've had residents wake up and discover something happened to their property while they were sleeping. Your resident associates that experience with where they live, right? But crime has a hidden housing cost, right? And this is something I don't think we discuss nearly enough. Crime increases the cost of housing, not necessarily because somebody immediately raises the rent after a theft, but because crime creates additional operating costs, right? More cameras, more lighting, more fencing, more access control systems, right? More insurance claims, potentially higher insurance premiums, broken windows, damaged doors, stolen equipment, security services, property management time, staff time, tenant turnover. Imagine two identical apartment buildings. Building A is in an area where residents rarely experience property crime. Building B experienced repeated vehicle break-ins, right? Building B now installs cameras, upgrades lighting, adds fencing, replaces damaged equipment, potentially hires security, deals with additional insurance issues, and loses residents who decide, I don't want to deal with this anymore, right? Those aren't abstract social costs anymore. Those are line items on a property operating statement. And tenant turnover might be the most underestimated cost of crime. Suppose a resident likes their apartment. They like the neighborhood. They like the restaurants. They like their neighbors, right? But their car gets broken into. They stay, then somebody steals their wheels, right? Now they're nervous, right? Then something happens to another resident's vehicle. When their lease comes up, they might leave, right? Not because the apartment wasn't good, not because management wasn't responsive, not because the neighborhood wasn't improving, but because they no longer feel safe. Now the landlord has turnover costs, right? Cleaning, repairs, marketing, leasing commissions, potential concessions, lost rent while the apartment is vacant. So public safety isn't separate from neighborhood revitalization. Public safety is part of the economic infrastructure of a neighborhood. This brings us to something incredibly important. Crime has two different realities: actual crime and perceived crime. They're related, but they're not identical, right? Imagine crime falls 25%. That's great. But somebody gets their car stolen tonight. You can wake up to them tomorrow and say, hey, look, actually, statistically speaking, motor vehicle theft declined significantly last year, right? They're probably not going to say, oh, wonderful, I feel much better, right? Their car is still gone. This is why statistics and lived experience sometimes collide. A city can objectively become safer while individual residents simultaneously experience serious crime. Neither person is necessarily lying. They're measuring different things. Now, there's also another factor previous generations didn't have, right? Your Ring camera, right? Your neighbor's Ring camera, Facebook, Nextdoor, citizen type apps, Instagram, group chats. Somebody gets caught looking into somebody's car at 3:14 in the morning. 30 years ago, maybe 3 people knew. Today, by breakfast, there are 6 camera angles, right? Slow motion, a neighborhood Facebook thread, and somebody's aunt commenting. This is why I moved to Arizona, right? That type of visibility is good, right? It helps identify suspects, it alerts neighbors, it documents incidents, but it also can create the perception that crime is occurring everywhere constantly. We now consume crime differently, basically. But with all that said, crime is hyper local here in the city of Detroit. And this may be the most important thing for people who don't live in Detroit to understand. Detroit is enormous, approximately 139 square miles. Crime isn't distributed evenly across those 139 square miles, right? Two neighborhoods can have dramatically different experiences. Two streets inside the same neighborhood can have different experiences. Heck, sometimes two blocks can feel completely different, right? That's why statements like Detroit is dangerous aren't particularly useful, but neither is Detroit is safe, right? The better questions are where, what type of crime, at what time, how frequently, and compare it with what period, right? That's how you actually analyze a city. Now, let's connect this directly to real estate development. Suppose we've spent years revitalizing a commercial corridor. We renovate vacant buildings, open restaurants, build apartments, add retail, improve sidewalks, bring residents back. Then people repeatedly get their cars broken into. What happens? Eventually, somebody says, I'm not going back over there, right? That's devastating because commercial districts survive on repeat customers. The restaurant doesn't care that homicide declined 35% over 2 years if customers believe their cars aren't safe in the parking lot. The retailer doesn't care, right? The apartment developer doesn't care. The insurance company definitely doesn't care. Perception becomes economic realty, and that's why quality of life crime deserves attention even while violent crime is declining. Now, this is where I want to zoom out a little bit because if the entire crime discussion becomes lock everybody up, we're missing something. Crime doesn't materialize randomly. Detroit has neighborhoods that have experienced decades of population loss, concentrated poverty, abandonment, vacant property, school instability, limited employment opportunities, trauma, disinvestment, right? Those conditions don't excuse someone stealing somebody's car. If somebody steals my tenant's vehicle, I'm not going to tell them, hey, look, let's examine the socioeconomic conditions that produce this behavior. No, not at all, right? They want their car back, and whoever did it should be held accountable. But if our objective is reducing crime long term, we have to ask why this behavior exists in the first place, right? That's where enforcement and prevention have to coexist. With that said, Detroit's recent crime decline appears to involve multiple strategies rather than one silver bullet. Local officials have pointed to cooperation between DPD, prosecutors, federal law enforcement, and community organizations. Detroit has also expanded community violence intervention efforts, where organizations work directly with individuals and neighborhoods at elevated risk of gun violence. That distinction matters. Traditional policing asks, who committed the crime? Violence intervention also asks, who is most likely to become involved in the next shooting, and can we intervene before it happens? You need accountability, but preventing the shooting is obviously better than solving the shooting. And whatever combination of factors is driving the decline, the results deserve serious examination. But here's what I don't want Detroit to do, right? Take these historic crime reductions and turn them into a victory lap, because 165 homicides are still 165 homicides. 447 people being shot and surviving is still 447 people being shot, right? 6,391 motor vehicle thefts are still 6,391 stolen vehicles. Behind every statistic is somebody's father, somebody's daughter, somebody's tenant, somebody's employee, somebody trying to figure out how they're going to get to work tomorrow because their car disappeared overnight, right? The correct response to improving crime statistics isn't problem solved. It's something is working. How do we accelerate it? Now, what I want to see next, for me, Detroit's next public safety challenge is bigger than simply reducing homicide, right? We need to continue reducing violent crime while attacking the everyday property crimes that undermine people's quality of life. Vehicle theft, will theft, break-ins, burglary, commercial theft, vandalism, because those are the crimes that can quietly undermine neighborhood confidence. And I'd like to see public safety discussed more directly as part of economic development. We talk about streetscapes, we talk about tax incentives, we talk about affordable housing, we talk about retail attraction, we talk about beautification, right? Those things matter. But imagine spending $10 million improving a corridor and residents still don't feel comfortable leaving their vehicle there, right? That's a problem. Public safety is economic development. Ultimately, this crime conversation represents something much bigger about Detroit. Detroit is improving and Detroit still has serious problems, right? Those aren't contradictory statements. Detroit can have its lowest homicide numbers in decades and still have too many homicides. Detroit can reduce vehicle theft by more than 20% and still have thousands of vehicles stolen, right? Detroit can attract billions of dollars in investment, while residents in some neighborhoods still deal with crimes that make them uncomfortable walking outside at night, right? That's what happens when a city is changing. Progress doesn't arrive everywhere simultaneously. So when somebody asks me, is Detroit safe? My answer is, that's the wrong question. The better question is, how much safer is Detroit becoming? Where are the remaining problems concentrated in? What are we going to do about them, right? Because the data clearly shows progress. Homicides are down, shootings are down, robberies are down, carjackings are down, vehicle theft is down, property crime is down. We should acknowledge that. But the lived experience of residents matters too. I've seen firsthand what happens when a tenant becomes a victim of theft. I've seen how quickly one incident changes someone's perception of their home. I've seen the additional responsibility it places on a landlord. And I've seen how something that might appear as one tiny line in a citywide crime database can become a major event in somebody's life, right? So I'm optimistic about where Detroit is heading. Don't get me wrong, but optimism shouldn't require pretending problems don't exist. Actually, I think it's the opposite. If you generally believe in Detroit, you should be willing to talk about these types of things Detroit still needs to improve. And public safety is one of them, right? So I want to hear from Detroiters specifically. Do you personally feel safer in Detroit today than you did 5 or 10 years ago? And here's a more interesting question. Has your experience changed as much as the statistics suggest it should have, right? Because I think the gap between those two answers is where the real conversation about crime in Detroit begins. Thanks for listening to me ramble. I'll see you in the next video.